Hey everybody, my name is Jason, also known as Pirate JC, and welcome to another Babylon video. This is part 7 of our epic video series entitled A Tech Artist's Journey, where we're going on a grand adventure together, a curvy, twisty adventure, like a hike through the woods to create this dancing morph target demo. In this series, we are not trying to take the most direct path to getting to this demo. It's the opposite. We're trying to take the goofy path, the road less traveled. We're trying to see something that maybe we've never seen before, to try something we've never tried before, to learn something new. So far in this series, we have created a mesh in Blender with shape keys and animation. We've stored that animation into a texture. We've brought it into Babylon, ripped the animation data back out and mashed it and morphed it into an animation that can be used in Babylon. And today we get the privilege of hooking up interaction into our scene and actually getting this thing working. So without any further ado, let's jump right on into where we left off in our last video. If you're following right along with the whole series, don't forget to save your work, save the point you're at in your playground. But picking up right where we left off, it's all about starting with the keyboard. We're going to use the space bar to animate these things. And here's how we're going to go about doing that. We have to start by thinking about what happens when a bar animates. We're going to go through, and when we press the space bar, we're going to constantly loop through and say, let's create pick a random bar of our 64 morph target bars. If one of them is animating and we accidentally pick that one again or randomly pick that one again, if its animation hasn't completed, it may pop back to frame 0, its starting point, which means that we need to take on the responsibility of keeping track of which bars are actively animating and which ones aren't. So we're going to start by creating a new array called isAnimating. Okay, and this array will be blank for right now, and we'll populate it as we go. And we're just going to get right into adding spacebar support into our scene. So here's how we're going to go about doing this. We're going to say scene dot on keyboard observable dot add, and we'll add a new function to this that this will run. It's going to take in something automatically that's passed from the on keyboard observable, which is the KB info. That's what we'll call it. And then our function is going to look something like this. If we press the space bar, now that's going to be here's how we'll do that. If the KB info dot event dot key is equal to space, that's it, that's simple, then we're going to do something. Let's make sure that this works by console logging something. We'll just console log the word test, and we're going to hit play, and I'm now holding down the space bar. I've released it, and we'll open up our console, and there we see that we wrote out test several times as I held down that space bar. Perfect. So now what we need to do is we need to go animate what we want to, the animation itself of the specific bar that we've chosen. But we haven't chosen a bar just yet. We're going to do all of that work inside of a function because we're actually going to use it again later in this video. So we're going to pretend that we have a function created called animate random bar. And we'll go fill this out in a minute. We'll write it in a minute. And that is going to take in 4 different arguments. The first one that it's going to take is it's going to take the animations array. Now, from our last video, you may recall that we took the animation data out of a texture and built that into an animation, but we returned it as an array, as an instance inside of an array. And the reason we wanted to do that is because later, the thing that actually, the line of code that creates the animation itself, that requires an array. So that's why we have the animations array, which has one single animation in it. We also want to pass in the isAnimating array so that we know which bars are animating and which ones aren't, and we can affect that. And then we want to pass in the things that we are going to animate, which are the morph targets. And then finally, we're going to need to pass in the scene context as well. So now we're ready to go create our function. We're going to go all the way down to the bottom. I'm going to give ourselves just a little bit more room here so that we can see. And we'll jump in by saying let animate random bar equal function. And it's going to take in those same 4 arguments. It's going to take in the animations array. It's going to take in the isAnimating array, and it's going to take in bar morph targets and scene. And so here's what we're going to do. The very first thing is we need to pick a random number. We have 64 bars, okay? We need to pick a random number between 0 and 63 because we count starting at 0. So it's going to look something like this. Let morph equal math.random times, now math.random will return a random number between 0 and 1. And we're going to say math.random multiplied by, and this is going to be the bar morph targets dot length, so the number of morph targets that we have, but minus 1 because the length property is 64, and we want to go from 0 to 63, and so that's why it looks like this. So let's console log this and see what happens. I can type, I promise. So we'll console log morph, press play. I'm going to hold down the space bar for a second, bring up our console, and we see we are in fact getting a random number, a really random number between 0 and 63 in this case. Okay, looks like we got up to 61 almost as our highest. But we need to use this as an index of the bar morph targets array to pick a specific morph target to animate, which means we need this to be a whole integer, which means then we need to round it. So before we finish here, let's encapsulate this in parentheses so that we can then say over here, math.round. And now when we print it out, again, holding spacebar and then going back, you see we have whole integers here that we can actually use as indexes to pull a random morph target from our bar morph targets array. Okay, awesome. So we have now picked a random number. And what we want to do is we want to say, is that random number currently animating? And the way that we're going to keep track of this is by saying if, and this is a little tricky here, but what we're essentially going to do is we're going to say is animating dot index of morph. So we're going to go see if morph is in this array. If it is in this array, we will return the index number of where it's found in that array. However, if it's not found, then it will return a -1. So in this case, our if statement is effectively saying, if the morph, the random morph number that we just created between 0 and 63 is not currently animating, then we're going to animate it, okay? And actually the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to say, well, we need to add it to the animating array, right? So if it's not actively animating, let's first say it is now actively animating so we can keep track of that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to actually animate it. So I'm going to type scene.begin direct. Now we have a problem here. You may notice that autocomplete, the IntelliSense that helps us know what options we have to continue here, it's not completing. And that's because we're using JavaScript, not TypeScript, and it thinks that scene is any type of an object and it's lost the context of scene. Not a big deal. What we can do to get around this is cheat and go back up into the context of the scene here and write this function here. So what we're going to say is we're going to say scene.begin direct animation. Okay, and then the parameters that this takes is a target. Now we want a specific bar morph target. The one that we want is the random one that we've chosen, morph. And then what is the array of animations that should be animated? And in this case, it's the animations array, remember, but it only has one animation in it. And then we're going to go from 0 to frame 31. That's how many total frames we have. And then do we want it to loop? We do not. Speed ratio of 1. And then when the animation has completed, we want to do something. So we're going to say function. This is a callback for when the animation is done. And then we're going to say let index equal is animating dot index of, and then morph. So what this is going to do is it's going to give us the specific index number in the isAnimating array where we can find that particular number, that particular morph target number, okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to say isAnimating.splice, and then we're going to say index, and we want to splice one thing. So what splice does is it finds a certain number of entries of an element in an array, and then it splices the ends back together after it's removed it. So there will only be one of these instances in there. We want to remove it and then splice the array back together, and that's what that will do. So it will effectively pull it back out. So now that we've written it up here easily, we'll cut it out of the scene context and go back down, and we'll add it to the animate random bar function that we've been creating, okay? And then we need to tab over here and tab back there. And there we go. We should now be ready to actually see animation when holding the space bar. So again, just to run through this once really fast. Up here we have a keyboard observable that when the space bar is pressed will animate a random bar, okay? And then in the animate a random bar, we'll first pick a random number between 0 and 63. And then we'll see if that number is a morph target that's actually animating. If it's not, then we will add it to the array that says that it's animating and begin an animation on it, the up and down animation. And then of course, once that animation has completed, we want to pull that number back out of the isAnimating array so that it's once again eligible to be called and animated again. Did you follow all that? Let's see if it works. We'll hit play, we'll hold down spacebar, and there we go. We have dancing morph targets. How cool is that? Okay. We do have a problem though. Let me hit play again and look closely at what happens, especially during the first few frames of holding down the spacebar. You see that flickering, that kind of inconsistent flickering there? That's a problem. Now it's a problem actually that Babylon is sort of introducing on our behalf. See, there's an optimization that's done automatically by the engine. It's on by default that says if a morph target has an influence of 0, and this optimization is set to true, it will not be evaluated during the render, okay? Now, as we're animating it very, very quickly. It's a fast animation, and there's a conflict that happens with that optimization as to whether or not a specific bar that should be animating has an influence of 0 related to the animation or not, and so it gets this weird flickering, strange behavior. Ultimately, what that means is we just need to turn off this optimization because we want to be more in control. Now, normally this optimization, 95% of the time, is actually awesome for us because most of the time, if a morph target has an influence of 0, it's really not worth evaluating. But in this case, it's causing some weird behavior, so we can simply take it out, and we'll do that back up here where we first load in our bars, and we're going to say bars.morphTargetManager dot optimize influencers, and that's going to be set to false. So now when we play and we press spacebar, it looks nice and smooth, okay? And so that is just a little bitty gotcha. Again, 95% of the time that optimization is going to be helpful to you, but in this case, we want to turn it off and we want that control. And one of the amazing things about Babylon is it is both helpful, but you also are ultimately in control, so you can do what you want. So awesome! We have dancing bars now when we press the space bar. This is so cool! But we also want to add a GUI button so that when we press a button, it will also animate the bars. And that's why we've written our animation into a function so that we can reuse that. But to use a button, we're going to go about this in a kind of different way. We're going to tell the scene that before you render every frame, do a check for us on something and then do an animation. Let's dive in and see what that looks like. The very first thing is when we click down on the button, we're not going to say animate. When we click down on the button, we're going to set a parameter equal to true. We're going to have a new variable here called dancing, okay? And we're going to set dancing equal to to 0 to start. And then we'll create a button and we'll modify that based on whether you're pressing the button down or releasing the button. And we'll get to that in a second. So next thing is we're going to go ahead and create a full screen GUI, and we can do it like this. We'll say let dance GUI equal Babylon.GUI.advanced dynamic texture.create full screen UI. And then it wants a name as a parameter, so we can call this dance GUI. And then we're going to create a GUI button, an actual button to interact with. So we'll say let GUI button equal Babylon.GUI.button.create simple button. And that's going to take in two arguments. One, it wants a name. We can call it GUI button. And then the second thing that it wants is the text that it should display, if any. And so I want it to say morph target dance. That's going to be the text that we want it to say. Okay, lastly, before we can actually see anything here, we need to say dance GUI.add control, because we've added a specific, we've created a GUI button, but we haven't added it to the context of the full screen GUI yet. And we do that with that simple line of code. We hit play, and now you have a giant, transparent, full screen button. You can actually see it. If we click it, it says morph target dance on it. Well, that's not super duper helpful. Obviously, we need to do some work to make this look better than it does right now. So the way that we're going to do this is after we've created the button, okay, before we add it to the full screen GUI, the dance GUI that we created, we're going to do a couple things to it. So first thing we'll say is GUI button.width, and we want that to be 0.3, GUI button.height, and we're going to make that 0.05. Now we can press play and see what that looks like. There we go. Looks pretty good. Let's round out the corners next, shall we? So we'll say GUI button dot corner radius equals 10 is a good one for this. And then next we're going to say GUI button dot background color, is equal to, we'll call this blue. All right. And then GUI button dot color, and that's going to be equal to white. That's going to be the color, the main color of the text. Let's go ahead and hit play and see what it looks like now. Cool. Looking a little bit better. That's good. Still not in the right position though. So what do you say we actually modify this a little further? We're going to say GUI button dot horizontal alignment equals Babylon.GUI dot control and we want to say horizontal alignment center, okay? And then GUI button dot vertical alignment equals Babylon.GUI dot control dot vertical, and we want this to be vertical alignment bottom. And when we press play, it'll snap all the way to the bottom. That's a little too close to the bottom. In fact, my picture is actually covering it up here a little bit. What we'll do is we'll actually move it back up a little bit by doing this. GUI button dot top equals -50. And there we go. That's positioned pretty well. Here's a view of it for full screen just so that you can see it. And now what we're going to do is actually interact with it. We're now going to add the ability to observe if it's been pressed or not. And we can do that through two simple observables. The first is GUI button dot on pointer down observable. And of course, we add a new function. And that function is going to be very simple. It's just going to say dancing equals 1. If the button is pressed down, just set dancing to 1, okay? And what we can do here is let's do a console log, and we will log the state of whether it's dancing or not, just so that we can see. Now, the next thing that we want to do is the opposite. When GUI button on pointer up observable, so when we've lifted up on the mouse or the touch, then what we're going to do is we're going to say dot add, and we're going to set it to the opposite. So here we'll say function, and that is going to have dancing equal to 0. And then let's grab this here and console log it as well, just so that we can see this working. We'll go ahead and hit play. And now when I do this 1, 2, you should see a 1, 0, 1, 0 in the output. And sure enough, we sure do 1, 0, 1, 0. Awesome. Okay, so we're set up well now. Let's get rid of these console statements. But you're probably thinking to yourself, wait a minute. Okay, so we're setting a variable when we press this button to true or false, on or off, essentially. But what's the thing that's actually going to make animation happen? This is going to be a scene-wide observable I was mentioning earlier. What we're going to do is we're going to say scene dot on before render observable dot add. Okay. Now we're going to add a function in here. So this is going to run every single before every single frame is rendering. So if you're getting 60 frames a second, this is running 60 times a second. So you have to use this carefully, right? You can't use this do tons of heavy operation here because it's happening all of the time. So just, this is an awesome observable to use, but just use it cautiously. Okay, so essentially now this is pretty straightforward. Once we have this on before render observable, we're gonna say if dancing is equal to 1, then what we're gonna do is we're gonna simply say, guess what? The same thing we did up here, animate a random bar. And that effectively is going to, again, pick a random number, check if it's actively animating. If not, start up an animation, make sure it's now set to actively animating, and then it cleans itself up as it goes. Are you ready? We're going to hit play. Now here's spacebar. You can see it dancing, and then I'll let go, and we'll hit the GUI button, and we have dancing. How cool is that? That is us adding interaction to our scene. So now we've taken the animation out of the texture, created a Babylon animation with it after morphing it and mashing it, and now we've added interactivity, picked a random bar, and started animating it. How cool is that? So awesome. It is my sincere hope that throughout this series that you're learning something new, and that this video is no exception to that. I want to thank you personally so much for coming along on this journey with me, and ask you humbly that if you haven't already had a chance to do so, please consider subscribing to this channel so that you don't miss any of the future updates that we bring to it. Again, thank you so much for coming along on the journey, and we'll see you in the next one.